Great. So this is the Morden and Dengie Beekeepers Club Association, and we'd like to welcome Kevin Thorn, who is giving a talk on preparing bees for winter. Looking forward to it, Kevin. So I think the floor's yours.
Great. I'm just going to click on mute all.
It's not 8 o'clock yet.
7:30 it was supposed to be.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to mute everybody. Apart from myself, you can unmute yourself if you need to, but it'd be helpful to save questions to the end. Right. So for those that haven't heard me speak before, my name's Kevin Thorn. I'm a bee farmer from southwest Suffolk. Currently, last time I looked, 100 colonies. I'm chair of West Suffolk Beekeepers, and I coordinate the Abberton Native Bee Group, which I've spoken to you about before. And my aim is helping beekeepers raise and improve their own queens. So Carly asked me to talk about preparing your bees for winter. And I think the main thing to bear in mind is that what we're looking to do is to get your colonies ready to take full advantage of the spring flow. Another thing I'm going to talk about, and there may be a few things that aren't in the books that I'll talk about this evening. One of which is to think about replacing your winter losses before they happen. So that's about making up nukes, taking them into, or extra colonies to take into winter to allow for winter losses. You want strong colonies going into winter. You know, there's probably not much point taking a 1 or 2 frame hive into winter. You need them treated, fed, and secure. Your queen excluders removed, and you want to nadir, or sometimes it's called under-supering if you're going to, or a single brood box is usually sufficient for the bees. But basically the principle of nadiring or under-supering is basically you take a super and put it underneath your brood box, and what happens there is that the bees tend to move up during the winter, and they'll be underneath the crown board when you open them up in the spring. If you leave a super in the hive, there's a chance, doesn't always happen, but there's a chance that when they move up, they'll move up into the super and start laying in the super. So by moving the super under, you're giving them space, you're giving them extra space for storage. You're also possibly giving them a bit of a wind baffle if you're using open mesh floors. And I do this, but I do it mainly for somewhere to store a super. That's my main reason. So winter bees, these are absolutely crucial. As you know, summer bees live typically for 6 weeks and winter bees live typically for 6 months. They need a lot of pollen. They're going to be bringing in lots of pollen in sort of like August, end of July, August into September, because they're building up their fat levels in the fat bodies, so that they are going to live much longer than they would do in the summer. So it's mainly the fat that's stored in the fat bodies. Another thing that's important about the fat bodies, there's a really good video, I can't remember the guy's name, Samuel Ramsey, who talks about the impact of Varroa feeding on the bees' fat bodies and what that does to them. So if you Google that, you'll it's well worth looking at. But the winter bees need to live long enough to raise the spring brood. And Varroa, if a pupae has been parasitized by Varroa, it's going to reduce the bee's lifespan by 25%. And, you know, for those mathematicians out there, that means that they're going to live for about 4.5 months, which means they're going to die before the main brood raising season. So this is one of 2 reasons why colonies mainly collapse in March. And one of the other things I would mention is that one of your aims here is to get your bees to be alive in April. And lots of people I see on forums saying it's February, my bees have survived the winter. Until you're through the end of March, you're not through the winter. March is the most dangerous month. Bees can run out of food and they can run out of basically life force because they've been parasitized. And the only real time you can make a big difference to winter survival of your bees is late summer treatment. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And this is what's going on in your hive during the season and why treating for Varroa can be so important. So the dark green line on the graph is the worker bee population during the year, and then the pale green line is your mite population. The key on the left is number of bees and the key on the right is number of mites. And as you can see here, this is kind of like as if you've treated the bees on the 1st of January, so you've reduced the mite count close to 0, and then the mites have just increased their population over a season. And as you can see, sort of like August, September, the number of mites peak, but the population of bees is decreasing. And what that means is that you've got more mites in the hive and fewer bees, which means that all of a sudden a very high proportion of the bees are being parasitized. And also at that time of year, that's when your winter bees are being born. So, you know, that is really the time at which, if your colony is going to fail due to Varroa, that's when it starts. Now, these days, there are some colonies that are resistant to mites, and if they are resistant, then that's fantastic. But for the majority, I'd say 95% of colonies, and probably all those where we already treat, are going to go through this pattern. So think about colony strength. Usually one strong colony is going to have much more chance than 2 weak colonies to get through. So if you've got 2 colonies on 3 frames of brood in September, or 3 frames of bees covering the frames, then you're probably better off combining them. So it's a matter of checking that they're both okay disease-wise and trying to understand why the queen isn't laying. It could be due to disease, in which case you need to be careful combining disease colonies, because obviously you're risking spreading disease. But it could be that a queen is just coming towards the end of her life. One of the queens might be younger than the other, and you can nip the older queen and combine the 2. In the spring, there's a good chance that they'll be stronger, they'll expand quickly in the spring, and you'll be able to make another split and recover the position. So I think sometimes taking 2 weak colonies through the winter is false economy. There's a good chance you'll lose them both. And even if you get 1 colony through, you'll get 1 weak colony rather than 1 strongish colony. I use cedar hives on all my full colonies, and I use polystyrene nukes on all my nukes. I found that polystyrene can help some of my colonies that are formed in sort of like August get through, keep building brood up until this sort of time of year, and be strong enough to go through the winter. I don't upgrade nukes to full hives from August onwards, even if they're bursting at the seams. They're not going to swarm in August, or 99.999% not going to swarm, and so they're better off just staying a strong nuke than a weak hive. And one of the things I aim for is to overwinter one nuke for every 2 hives. So I said earlier, I've got 100 colonies. That's about 70 colonies and 30 nukes. You probably don't need to overwinter this higher proportion, but you probably do want to do 1 nuke for every 5 hives to allow for a 20% loss rate. Now, feeding is obviously crucial, and I think it's something that there's a lot of myths about feeding, and there's you really want to be thinking about what your bees are doing when you want to feed. So I'm feeding my bees. When my supers come off, my feeders go on and my treatments go on. So, and the reason I'm feeding immediately after the supers have come off is because I'm feeding for winter bees. I'm building winter bees. By mid-August, when I'm taking my supers off, there's very little flow in my area. There might be an ivy flow some years in September, but in August, there's not been a lot. So I really want to make sure my bees have got some food, and I'll probably give them about 4 pints, half a gallon, and then see how they do. But given that I'm taking away their winter stores, I want to give them an initial feed then. Another thing to be careful of, again, some of the books will say feed and feed and feed your bees until they won't take any more. Now, it can be very difficult to do that because bees are quite greedy and will take whatever easy food is available. Certainly some colonies will. But if you do that, the bees will completely stuff the brood area, and the queen won't have room to lay, and she won't have room to lay the winter bees. So you want to feed, but feed moderately. And I'll talk about how you know how much you have fed. Also, in late July, early August, you should expect to see the amount of pollen in a hive expand considerably. And sometimes the first 3 frames in a brood box are pollen. And again, sometimes people worry about that, but that is perfectly normal. The bees are bringing in pollen to feed the winter bees. Bees will forage on ivy pollen and nectar if it's available. This year, it doesn't seem to have been available. I've not seen any evidence that they've brought in much ivy honey. There's been some ivy pollen, but it's been so wet and yet so warm that the bees have actually continued to raise brood, and they've actually gone, if you fed your bees early, they may have already eaten that to turn into more brood. So it's important to keep a very close eye on the bees. Again, people think that bees consume food in winter and that we're feeding for winter. Bees consume very little in the winter normally, particularly when it's cold. They don't consume much to keep warm. Most of the food that we give them is used to raise brood. And at the moment, they're still doing it. So there's more bees in the hive. They're not able to get out because of the damp weather. And it, you know, the National Bee Unit probably ought to be issuing warnings about this at the moment. And then I actually give a winter feed mid to late September, and that's the food that the bees are actually going to store. And what I'm finding right now, as I said, is the bees are actually needing a top up, and I'm still feeding, I have been until now, still feeding liquid, but I'll be switching now to fondant if needed. How you monitor your feed is by hefting or weighing. Hefting is just lifting one side of the hive and judging how heavy it is, and it should be difficult to lift, and you need to get used to what a full hive feels like. I actually weigh my hives, and I'll show you how to do that fairly simply. And as I said, bees don't keep stores much for keeping warm. In a cold winter, the bees will stay heavy all the way through. Most is used in brood production, and most is used in February and March. So I think of my winter feeding as actually more spring feeding. Yes, they do need a bit for winter, but most of it will be used in the spring. Hold on. So I've got people waiting to come in, so I'm trying to admit. There we go. And say some of it is being used in brood production right now, so take care. Cool. If your bees are light, you can top up with fondant between now and the end of February, and probably by the time it's more than 10 degrees centigrade in March, you can actually feed liquid feed, and obviously you want to be doing that without any supers on at all, whether they're on top of the brood or under it. So you want to remove any supers if they're there. So monitoring feed. So I use a set of luggage scales like the ones in the top right hand corner there. I say you can heft, but I weigh my hives during the winter, which is how I know how the bees use the stores during the winter. If it's warm enough, you can take a peek. If you want to, and it's warm enough, you really want 8 brood frames of whatever size hive you use full at the end of September, and that's going to be about £40 for a standard national. Hefting, lift one side of a hive, get used to the weight. It should be difficult to lift when full. Some people use one finger to lift the hive, because if they can lift it with one finger, it's too light, and if they can't, it's heavy enough. But again, that's going to vary person to person. So when I weigh one side of the hive, and a very clever Greek man called Archimedes worked this out for us 2,500 years ago. You double the result of the weight, and then that gives you the gross weight of the hive, including the hive, the bees, the stores, and the equipment, and then deduct the weight of an empty hive, and I can tell you how much a standard national weighs. An empty standard national with wax weighs about £22 with brood box only, or £30 with a super. So let's say, for example, you've weighed your hive, and one side of it is £30 in weight. You can double that and say you've got a gross weight of £30, and you've got a brood box with a super, deduct £30, and you know that the net weight of bees and stores is £30. Now, 10,000 bees weighs £2 in weight. So the weight of the bees isn't worth worrying about. So you've got about £30 of stores. You're a little bit light, so you probably want to put a bit of fondant on right now. And as I say, you want a net weight of £40 for a British standard setup. So dangerous periods are cold periods where isolation starvation can occur. Isolation starvation is where bees are clustered in a tight cluster and the food is somewhere else in the brood box or even above the crown board. And also March, where lots of stores are going to be used in a short period. Half of those £40 of stores that you want to be on now are really for March. That's when they're going to really go through the stores. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Just moving on to treatments. I'm only going to talk about treatments that I have used. The one in the picture there is Thymovar, which is a thymol-based treatment. And those are 5 strips in there. You tear them in half and 2 go in a hive just on top of the frames. And that treatment is repeated after 3 weeks. I tend to use Thymovar mainly on my nukes as they're a pretty gentle treatment. And I use something more stronger on the full colonies. Last year I used Max. A lot of people don't like Max, but I do. There was a lot of talk about Max causing queens to disappear. And I think when it was first launched, that did happen. But everybody I speak to that has used Max since the first couple of years is happy with it. And everybody that used it in the first 2 years has never used it since. So they swear that it's dreadful stuff, but they haven't used it recently. It's handy because it's a quick 7-day treatment. It is pretty severe. The bees really don't like it, but it is over and done with in a very short period. I used it on my bees for the first time last year, and I didn't lose a single queen. In fact, I lost a few queens on the hives that I didn't treat with Max. As I say, I've talked about Thymovar. This year I've used Apivar. Apivar is Amitraz. That's got the advantage of it just needs 1 treatment for 10 weeks, but you must take it off after the 10 weeks. Otherwise the bees may develop resistance. True of all your treatments, really. It's good to alternate your treatments to reduce resistance. In December, January, you can do oxalic acid. I've dribbled and I've vaped. And bear in mind that when you treat in late summer, so August, September, you're really treating your bees for the winter, and your December, January treatment is really to knock back any mites that have developed since then, and really give your bees a good start to the spring. So your December, January treatment is more about giving colonies a good start to the spring. Obviously, we do the oxalic acid in December, January because the bees are broodless, and all treatments apart from Max don't work on capped brood. When using any treatments, you do need protection, so you want to wear gloves and goggles when using any treatment. But when you're using oxalic vape in particular, you really want to have a breathing mask that is high standard, the sort of stuff that a coronavirus couldn't get through. But it's I can't remember the letters that go before it, but it's one that's good for organic acids, which oxalic acid is. Protecting bees. This is an interesting one, and one where I'm possibly a little bit controversial. Wasps. A lot of beekeepers go to extraordinary lengths to protect their hives against wasps. And in my early days as a beekeeper, I did too. But for the last 3-4 seasons, I've done very little to protect against wasps. The only thing I've done is I've reduced the entrance on the polyneuks to 1 bee space, because a lot of these colonies are just getting going. But my full hives, I leave the entrance block in all year round, and the bees protect themselves against wasps. If wasps are getting into a colony, I find it's actually telling me that there's a problem with the hive. Usually there's a problem with the queen. She's not giving enough pheromone to hold the colony together as a cohesive unit, and the wasps are getting in. The other possibility is that the box is too big for the bees, and they probably want to be if they're in a full hive, the wasps sometimes go around the colony up into a feeder if you've got one on, and the bees don't see the whole hive as part of the colony. But when they're actually getting into the bees and the brood and starting to take that apart, that's a queen issue. So if your wasps are going in, that tells you there's a problem. You need to deal with a problem in the hive. You don't need to worry about wasp traps and such like. Another common myth that I've come across is, if wasps do start to rob a hive, leave them to rob it out, because if you don't, they'll start robbing the next colony if you remove it. I've found that to be a myth. If you remove a weak colony, the bees will try it on with the next colony. But if that colony is strong enough, the wasps will give up, and the next time you come, you won't see any wasps in your apiary. They'll have moved on to something easier. So basically, don't worry about wasps. I know it's really, really hard if you've got 1 or 2 colonies and wasps are invading your hive. So I can understand you wanting to do something to protect them. And it's a lot easier for me with multiple hives to say this, but you know, I've overwintered 100 colonies for the last 3 years, and I've not lost any hives to wasps. And I've even had mini nukes that I've been raising new queens in with just a cup full of bees, and they've been able to hold off wasps as a coherent colony, even though there was a wasp's nest only 100 yards away. Mice, also something you don't really need to worry about. I leave my entrance blocks in all year round, and that is the only mouse protection I do. I've never had a mouse in a colony, but I did have some empty nests in some of my spare equipment. Mice, if they did get into your hive, they would make a nest in a corner away from the bees that would be clustered, and they would eat the wax in your frames. They would make a mess, but they wouldn't kill the colony. So the chances of getting mice is low, and if they did, they're not going to kill the colony. So it seems to me to be a low risk, low impact risk. So it's actually not worth doing anything with. Also, I believe, I can't prove this, but I believe if you look at mouse guards, their design is pretty much similar to pollen traps. So they're more likely to strip pollen at a time of year when the bees really need pollen. So yeah, I don't use mouse guards, but if anybody would like to buy some, I've got about 100 for sale. Woodpeckers can be a nuisance, as you can see in this. This isn't one of my hives. Again, I don't do anything against woodpeckers, and I've had very little damage. But it is the sort of thing that if you did get an apiary where the woodpeckers do start to attack hives, you do need to take action. But as things stand at the moment, none of my hives have got any protection on. But if I do start to see it, then I will put protection on. But once you get above a certain number of hives, it becomes very difficult to, or a big job to protect all your colonies. Again, woodpeckers, if they make this sort of damage, it is repairable. And they're unlikely to kill the colony. Protecting bees weather. Now that picture there is one of my apiaries from last year, and that was the big storm that began with the letter C. I can't remember the name of it now, but this is one of my most exposed apiaries. And to be honest, if there's ever a high wind, this is the apiary I check first because of this incident. It's the first time it's happened, and it's the only time it's happened. But basically, these colonies were both a bit light on stores. If they'd been heavier, they might have held down a bit better. There's 2 nukes there. I do now strap all my nukes down, but if the whole stand goes over, the stands are not strapped down. But you can see in the box there, there's a cluster of bees in the middle. The bees were absolutely fine. You know, put the stands up. These bees here were very unhappy at being turned upside down, but they all went back in the boxes and were fine. So we'll talk a little bit more about this. So as I say, I do now strap down my polystyrene nukes. These nukes did have bricks on them, but clearly that wasn't enough. But I don't bother to weight down my hives or strap them. They're usually fine. The best protection is looking at your site selection. If your site is sheltered and you've got easy, fairly dry access, then you're usually pretty good. And it also depends which way the wind's blowing. If the wind blows from the side on these stands, they're absolutely fine. But this particular wind was actually over 70 miles an hour, which rarely happens. And other than one other apiary, all 100 other hives were fine. In fact, I had some polynukes that were down by a river without any bricks on them, and I had visions of them floating down the river. But there's a big railway bank down one side, and they were completely sheltered from the wind, and they were absolutely fine. So another thing that is worthwhile just thinking about is exactly what's happening in your colonies during the kind of like the 6 months of autumn, winter going into spring. So as we're kind of like seeing bees continue to produce brood until the weather gets too cold. And bees' brood production is largely driven by the temperature. And the scientists have done experiments in Canada where they've kept bees in temperature controlled situations, and they found, I can't remember if but I think the bees need to be at a warmish temperature for about 7 days for them to start producing brood. So if the temperature fluctuates widely and drops below about 10 degrees centigrade, they won't start making brood. But once it goes above 7 degrees, about 10 degrees, I think it was, I might not be right on that, but once it goes above a certain level, bees start to produce brood. December and January, bees are typically broodless. Bees will cluster only when it's cold. So when it's warm enough, like it has been, bees won't cluster tightly. They'll spread out amongst the hive. They'll collect food from the edges of the box and constantly move it closer to the brood when they have the chance. Bees will take cleansing flights when it's warm enough. And I've seen bees flying at about 4 degrees centigrade. Again, the books say your bees won't fly below 12 degrees centigrade, and everybody gets very excited when they see the bees flying at 10 degrees and 8 degrees. It varies colony to colony, and I think, and although I don't know this, it possibly depends on how desperate they are. If they don't need to cleanse and they've got plenty of resources, plenty of water, then why would they go out just for the sake of it? But that's my belief rather than what I know. So I think it was last year we had, or it might have been the year before, we had 20 degrees centigrade weather in February. So I did have a look in some of my hives in the garden. Wouldn't do that normally, but I say it was 20 degrees centigrade. And I noticed that the colonies had 1 or 2 frames of brood. All of it was in a single pattern. So it looked like they had actually started at the beginning of February. So unless they'd laid in January and it had all hatched out and been relayed, I would say that they'd been broodless in January. And they were bringing in some pollen, and there was also some liquid food around the brood nest. And I don't know whether that was nectar that they'd found or whether they had actually just liquidized some of their stores. But it was just interesting to see what the bees are up to at that time of year. As I say, when I weigh the bees during the winter, I find that the bees use about 5 pounds of stores for the winter months, and they can keep bringing in weight well into December. But they really start, it kind of like plateaus December, January, and then February, they go through about 10 pounds of stores on average, and then in March, about 20 pounds of stores. And again, this is the second reason, other than virosis, why bees might fail in March, is just that they run out, they're trying to build up brood. There's a lot of pollen about, but not a lot of plants that yield nectar. And that's the main reason the bees are storing honey, is not partially for winter, but probably less than 25% of the stores are for winter. 75% is for spring buildup. By April, your spring flow's starting and the bees are starting to bring in nectar. And the bees should by now have built up to about 6 frames by the end of April. And my best colonies and the colonies that I breed from will be on about 9 frames by the end of April. I look for strong spring buildup from for bees to breed from, because not only does it mean that they're ready for a spring harvest, it also means they've got to be pretty healthy, because sick bees don't build up like that. So it's actually a colliery for healthy bees. Also, the other key criteria for me is temper. And then another thing that I weed out of my colonies is the tendency to swarm. If I've got colonies at the end of April that are still on 1 or 2 frames, as far as I'm concerned, they've effectively failed. So I'm going to nick the queen and combine with one of the overwintered nukes, because they could recover by the end of the summer, but they're probably going to spend all the summer recovering from the slow start. There may well be a problem with them. So I'm going to take a very healthy queen full of bees and combine them. There is a small disease risk. Obviously, I'm going to look and make sure there's nothing overt, but the vigor of a brand new queen, which will have been mated late last season, will overcome most problems. Another thing you're going to find in spring is colonies. You might find some drone layers. I usually end up with 4 or 5. It may be that the colony tried to supersede late in the season, wasn't successful. And to be honest, I don't mind drone layers in some respects, in that I shake them out, the bees go into the nearest hive, and within a few weeks, that colony is then ready to split again. So you might as well shake them out rather than trying to requeen a drone layer. Unite them with another colony, say shake them out. If there's a queen in there, the bees in the receiving hive will deal with her. And the bees will unite. If you shake the bees near the hive that you want them to go into, on the opposite side to the hive they came from, they pretty much go straight into the new hive. And as I say, it doesn't bother me too much, because I know that I'm going to really strengthen the hive that they go into, and it'll be ready to split into one or more nukes very soon. So some myths. One is bees can't survive on ivy honey. Now I think I've actually overwintered my bees entirely on ivy honey for 2 seasons. And when I did, my losses were, first season was 0, and the second season was the year of the beast from the east, when beekeepers were losing about 30% of the bees, and I lost 16%. So bees can, but the ivy caught me out a bit last year, and there's not been much this year. So I don't think you can rely on an ivy flow either. You know, if you want to, you can, and the bees have got enough stores to get them through September. You can wait and see what they bring in ivy wise, but really by late September, you really need to be making up any shortfall. But the bees can, and if you think about it, ivy honey is just really, really finely granulated honey. And we say that the bees can live off ivy honey, and then we feed them fondant, which is fairly similar. It might be a bit softer, but ultimately it's the same granularization, easy for somebody to say. So it makes sense that bees can feed on ivy. And when I've left bees just to feed on ivy, by the middle of May, the strong colonies have completely eaten all the ivy honey that they had, and only the weak colonies that need combining have got surplus ivy. Lots of beekeepers over winter say that their bees have died of isolation starvation. Isolation starvation is quite rare in this country, and what we see 9 times out of 10 is that there's 2 different types of thing you're going to see. So it's always worthwhile looking at bees to try and diagnose what you think they died of, if they did. Isolation starvation is usually where you've got a big cluster of bees on 4 or 5 or more frames, and there's stores at one end of the hive but no stores near them, and it's got cold, and the bees have basically not got enough food next to the cluster or within the cluster, and it's been too cold for them to move about the hive. And so you'll find bees with heads in the cells, but you'll see lots. With virosis, what usually happens is the bees dwindle, and they dwindle down to probably a hand-sized cluster on 1, 2, maybe 3 frames, heads in cells, and ultimately they've actually died of cold. They've dwindled because of virosis. The varroa depleted their life force in the autumn. Lots of the bees have died off, and there's now not enough bees to keep the cluster warm when it becomes cold. But because the bees have got heads in the cells, it can look very much like isolation starvation. But I'd say the difference between the two is isolation starvation is a big cluster of bees dies, and dwindling is a small cluster due to virosis. As I've touched on before, wasps aren't a problem. Another one I've come across is people advise you to turn your entrance block upside down. And the reason for this is that because the bees are dying and they're going onto the floor, they could block the entrance. The problem with turning the entrance block upside down is, if you do that, they will block the entrance unless you regularly sweep them out, because the bees won't be able to get them out the entrance. So I don't touch my entrance blocks from one year to the next. They stay in the right way up, spring, summer, autumn, winter, and I don't find loads of bees on the floor. the bees will clear the dead if they're strong enough and if it's warm enough. Again, if you've got a floor full of bees, it probably tells you there's actually something wrong with the colony. Yeah, I've touched upon feed until they stop taking it. I say feed when you take the supers off, 4 pints. And I said I'd talk about how you can tell. You can sort of like feel the weight in the hive and get used to feeling what you really want about by August. If they've got 4 frames of stores, that's plenty. But by the end of September, you'll want 8 frames. 4 frames of stores is going to feel like 20 pounds net weight, and 8 frames is going to feel like 40 pounds net weight. So you can either get used to feeling that and just give them a little bit and often. But if you mass feed them, you're just going to stop them being able to produce the bees they need, and they'll run out of steam before the spring. So you'll end up with a colony of dead bees full of stores, and you'll say, I can't understand what went wrong because I fed them and they still didn't survive. And another one that's very common is bees know best. Bees are incredible creatures, but they actually, when you understand their ecology, they're very much instinctive creatures, and they work on feedback loops. And sometimes the feedback loops don't work, and the beekeeper does know best. 9 times out of 10, the bees manage themselves, but I've seen colonies swarm themselves to death, i.e., I've left more than one queen cell and they just keep swarming until there's a cupful of bees left. I've caught all the swarms, and none of the swarms survived. And there's a good example of where bees definitely don't know best. So I'll pass it over to you guys for questions. I just need to unmute you, or you can unmute yourselves. I think Gary's. So it's the first time I've been in charge of one of these. So no. So yeah, so if you've got any questions, if you just unmute yourselves, let me know that you're still there.
I'm here. Is everybody else here?
I'm here.
I'm here.
We're here.
I'm here. Yeah, I'm here.
Hi guys.
Unmuting now. That's great.
Have you got some questions for? Have you got some questions for Kevin about your bees over the winter? So you all know what you're doing.
I think I know what I should be doing next year.
I haven't actually got any bees yet.
Yeah, I've got a question.
Yeah, go on, Gary.
Yeah, I'm new to beekeeping. This is like my sort of first real year. I've got fondant in at the moment. I've been feeding syrup. What you were saying about taking off the supers.
Yes.
I've taken the frames out. I've left the supers on. I've taken the frames out, and I've got a crown board as a sort of ceiling. Should I take the supers completely off?
So it sounds like what you've done is you've turned your super into an EC. You've just done it. So that's absolutely fine. So you have taken your supers off. You're just using a super as an EC so that you can put your fondant on. That's absolutely fine.
Okay. Yep.
It's not empty, is it, Gary? It's above
What's
the
not
crown
empty?
board. The super is above the crown board.
I've got the brood. I've got a brood and a half. So I've got on one of my hive. I've got 2 hives. One's not very big. The other one is massive. I've got a brood and a half on one, and then I've got queen excluder.
Take that
Then
out.
I saw that. So I'll take the queen excluder out. And what goes above the queen excluder?
You should take your queen
Crown board.
excluder out.
Take the queen excluder out, and then have a crown board.
Yeah. Then above your crown board, you've got your food, and around your food, you've got your super box without the frames as an eck, just to give you space there so that your roof fits properly.
Yep, and the crown board's got the porta bee escapes in.
Well, where you putting your feed? Is it directly above the frames?
I've put the fondant right on top of the frames.
Yeah, that's fine.
And then an eck. I've got a 2-inch eck round it.
Okay, I'm not sure what your eck is actually doing in this situation then.
It's just raising it up enough so I can get the fondant on.
But your fondant's below the crown board.
Yes.
So you should be able to get the fondant on. Okay.
You don't want a space. Have you
don't
got a
need-
void?
Obviously, if I put the crown board on top of the frame, you haven't got enough room to get the fondant on.
I thought you said the fondant was directly above the
Put the
frame
fondant over the hole.
and below so the fondant is over the crown board.
I've got the fondant is directly on top of the frames.
Right.
Then an eck and a crown board.
Right, got you.
Yeah.
Okay.
No.
I think you just need to be a bit careful with that setup because come the spring, the bees are going to fill that gap with comb.
Right. Yeah. I've got you. Yeah.
I actually put my fondant above the feed holes.
All right. So you take the porta bee escape out and put the fondant direct on it.
Yeah. There's pros and cons of both. Having the food directly in contact with the bees is safer. Having it above the crown board is cleaner and easier for the beekeeper.
Right.
There's nothing wrong with what you've done, but by middle of March, you really want to get that eck out of there. Otherwise, the bee's going to start building comb in it.
Yeah, I've got that. Yeah. Lovely. Yeah. My setup's just a little bit wrong.
It's not massively, no. It'll work. I mean, I think the thing with a lot of things in beekeeping, there's 101 different ways of doing it. I'm really just telling you how I do it.
Yeah.
And you can make your own minds up. And I'm happy to answer any questions about why I do things.
Yeah. I mean, I've got queen excluders on both hives, so obviously I didn't realise you had to take them off.
Again, it's safer. I know 1 or 2 bee farmers who actually leave supers above the hive, queen excluders in.
Right.
I don't, partly because I just really want to make sure. But one of the other advantages of putting the super under the brood box is that when the spring comes, the bees have picked it clean of any feed or anything that was in there the previous year. It is completely clean and ready just to put back on top of the hive above a queen excluder in March, and off they go again.
Right. Lovely. Thanks.
Next question. I can't see everybody, unfortunately.
Have we got any more questions?
From me.
Okay, Stephanie, go ahead.
No, I said not from me. Sorry.
Oh, not from you.
No, sorry.
That's all right. Anybody else? Neil, have you got any questions? How are your bees?
Neil's still
Still
muted.
muted.
Yeah, still here. Yeah, they're doing okay. One of them, the queens, I've lost the queen, so they're gonna fade away, but they're very small going into winter already. But
Okay.
yeah, 2 nukes are looking quite strong. Yeah, the others are looking good.
Excellent, excellent. Gary, what about you? Gary Caution, what about you? How are yours doing?
It's funny. I'm in a very similar position. I lost a queen during the summer. She just disappeared. I don't know where she went. Yeah, so I lost one. The other colonies really has been very, very good, and it's really, really strong. But other than that, I haven't had a problem. The weird thing is that I did try to re-queen it myself, thought I was unsuccessful, and yet the weak colony is still going, and I'm just sort of reluctant to kill it off.
I think it's too late to do anything with your bees at this time of year, other than make sure they've got enough food, make sure they've been treated.
Yeah,
that's it. If it's any consolation to people starting out, I mean, I got my first colony of bees in August, and I went to my first association meeting, and we had, I think, one of the seasonal bee inspectors there, and they said, has anybody here not treated their bees yet? And it was about November, and I sheepishly was the only person to put their hand up, and he kind of like had a bit of a pop at me. He was like, why on earth haven't you? I said, well, I explained the situation. He went, oh, that's okay. My teacher came round and treated them with oxalic in December, and they were fine. But yeah, we're all going to make missteps along the way. I still do. I didn't get my feeding right last year. It wasn't perfect last year, which has led me to where I am now.
Yeah.
As long as you learn from it.
Mary, how are your bees doing out on the marshes?
I was just going to, I have got a question.
Go for it.
One of my hives is, I've got the brood box, and I've left, or I put a super of honey on top because they hadn't got enough down below. And there are lots of them, and they're in a big ball, which include the super. So the super and the brood have got a great big ball of bees, and I'm a bit concerned that they're not going down into the brood box.
I wouldn't worry. The only downside of what you've done is that you'll probably find the queen laying in the super in the spring. Right. Yes. Which isn't the end of the world, but it's just easier and tidier. If you'd have put that super underneath the brood box, the bees would have brought the food up, and you'd have had a clean super with no queen laying. Okay. Right. Now, the bees at Abberton that I look after, we actually found, we overwinter those on double brood, or we did last year. We overwinter them on double brood. It was interesting that some of the colonies were 100% in the bottom brood box. Some colonies were 100% in the top brood box. Yes. And some of them were half and half between the two brood boxes. Yes. So when we talk about over supering and under supering, often the bees will stay exactly where they are. Yes. But what I find is when I put the super under, I've never had the queen laying in the bottom. So we're always playing percentages. Yeah. And if the bees were mainly in the brood box and they were just pulling the stores down, you might find they don't always move up into the super. But I would. So in effect, I've created a brood and a half, haven't I? Yes. Yeah. Yes. But what you can do is in the spring, you can find if you can find your queen, great. Yes. If not, you can just shake the bees off the super frames, put the queen excluder underneath. Yes. Let the brood emerge, and then you've got a super back. But the only problem is your super's now got will have brood larval skins in. Yeah, debris. Yes. Debris. Which is usable, but it's also going to be a magnet for wax moth in the future. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. No problem. So nothing that anyone said so far is insurmountable.
No.
Louisa or John, how are your bees doing?
Oh, they're right.
Yeah, we're both here. Yeah, they're doing quite good actually. They're both just in the brood because we didn't actually end up with any supers with any honey in to put on the bottom, but we've been liquid feeding them both hives. They have been roaring through it, but Dad actually just rang me before this Zoom call and said that they've slowed down a little bit now on their intake of the liquid feed.
Fantastic.
It's
sounds
just kind of
good.
what do we do at this point in terms of feeding now?
Well, so the only option really now is it's starting to get colder. So if they need it, you can put fondant on. Again, if your hives are all light, then you can put fondant on. Normally, if you get the feeding right earlier, in the autumn, then they shouldn't need it. But a lot of people will just put fondant on as an insurance policy, just in case the bees need it again, which is harmless.
Yeah. Okay.
And might be beneficial.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Can I touch on what Gary #1 said about the fondant and the inch to 2 inch gap between the brood and the super?
Yeah.
Can I just ask Gary if he has pushed the fondant down, or has he just put the brick of fondant in and then gapped up around it?
What I did, I flattened it as best I could.
Right.
Sliced it with a Stanley knife underneath, and then put it directly on top of the frames.
Right, I get it. Yeah. Wasn't too sure whether you kind of made the same sort of mistake as what we made the first time around, which is just put a block down and hope for the best.
Oh no! It's actually a half a block. I cut one block right in half. It's not that thick. It's only probably an inch thick.
Right.
It's not. It's in a pack, so it's in a plastic pack.
Lovely.
One more question to Kevin: is it too late now, or should I just leave well alone to move the super down to the bottom and start juggling stuff around?
As I understood it from what you said before, you're saying you have got a super somewhere. I thought you said you had an egg, a couple of inches.
I've got 2 hives. One is starting from the bottom, 1 brood and 1 super on. The other hive, which is much bigger, I've got a brood and a half, and then I've got 2 supers which are empty of frames.
Okay. I would probably take those off. I mean, because at the end of the day, they're actually not doing anything. The only thing that they're probably doing is just creating a space for warm air to rise.
Yeah, I've got kingspan that I've put in the roof.
Okay.
And I've wrapped round the bottom of the hive with damp coursing, which I did last year.
I would just not leave that empty space there, because that's where the hot air is going to go.
Yeah. So what I'll do, I'll just take the 2 supers off, drop that down, leave the kingspan in the roof. So I'm shortening it down, making it easier for them to keep it warm.
Yeah. The other thing I would just be very careful of, given your insulation, is just watch out for damp.
Yep. Condensation damp?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because ultimately cold won't kill your bees, but damp can.
Right.
I've got no experience. I don't insulate my hives. My nukes are polystyrene, so they are insulated by definition. But I use my setup is an open mesh floor, possibly a super, a brood box, or brood box without a super, crown board, which is glass, and then I've got fondant there, and then the roof just sits on top of that.
Right.
My fondant is in inch deep takeaway containers.
Yeah.
And I store them with fondant in, lid on. And when I want fondant, I just take the lid off, invert the takeaway container, and it keeps the fondant nice and moist.
Yeah.
It's not going to be able to dry out, and that goes over the feed hole. And if I think they need 2 of those, because there's about 600 grams in one of these, I'll just put 2 over 1 feed hole.
Right.
Because I've only got 1 feed hole in my glass crown boards.
Right. Yeah, I've got 2. Yeah. I blocked one off with gaffer tape, and I've opened the other one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I would also keep, unless you're actively feeding through a feed hole, you want your feed hole closed.
Right.
Otherwise, you're getting a draft coming through an open mesh floor through the hive into the roof area.
Yep. Yep.
When I've left my feed holes open, my roof has got so sodden wet that I thought they would rot.
Oh, right.
So I think just be careful. You know, I know people that use solid floors, and then this is another beekeeping myth that's come about, is people who raise their crown boards when using open mesh floors. Now, back in the day, Brother Adam used to use solid floors and would lift his crown board with matchsticks to allow some ventilation.
Oh, yeah.
Now, with a solid floor, that's fine, but with an open mesh floor, it's not. So it's kind of like good advice for a certain situation.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if you've got an open mesh floor, you've got enough ventilation without creating any more at the top. So have your ventilation at the bottom or the top, not both. I'm very, very happy to be challenged on anything I've said, because I'm aware that some of the things I've said are not in the books and could be considered controversial.
I might have made a mistake this year. I've got Apivar in the sort of sachets where you peel it back. Last year I treated it. This year I put my solid floors in September, or covered them in Vaseline to see if I could see, and I only over 4 days I had 8 varroa on there.
Okay.
So I didn't treat them. That may be wrong. Obviously.
Okay. I mean that's a.
I can't treat them now, can I?
Well, you could treat with oxalic in December or January.
Right.
But 8 mites on the floor from a passive drop actually could be quite a bit.
Right.
You wouldn't really want to be seeing more than 1 per day.
Yeah. No, this was probably more than. It's probably a week, and I counted them.
Okay. So I've actually done an experiment where I did exactly what you said. I put in a board with Vaseline, with crisscross markers on there so I can count the mites accurately. I put them in, and I had passive drops over 2 days of anything from 0 to 60 mites.
Oh.
I then treated them all with an oxalic vape, and this is sort of like beginning of January. And the drops I got, the hive that had 60 mites, when I put that into the National Bee Unit calculator, it said I had 36,000 mites in my hive, and I will have only had 10,000 bees.
Oh.
When I vaped it, I only had 600.
Right.
So arguably, I didn't need to treat it. Then other colonies that said they had none dropped 1,000.
Yeah.
So
that's why I said I may have done the wrong thing by not treating. Last year I did treat them. This year I didn't. I've still got like Apivar, but it's too late now, isn't it?
Well, I would say so. I don't think it's anything to panic about, but you might want to do an oxalic treatment in the winter.
I will do. Yeah, in December.
Yeah.
January. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say between Christmas and New Year is pretty much the safest time to do it.
Yeah.
Because they're most likely to be broodless then.
Right.
So yeah, there's nothing to panic about, but I just found that that drop was just so variable. You know, I did it on nearly 40 hives and counted each individual mite, and I say there was up to 1,000 dropped over a week, and I was counting them every day after the treatment, and I just found that it was just all over the place. And if I'd have gone by the passive drop, there'd have been there'd have been a handful of hives that I should have treated and I wouldn't have done. And there would have been some hives that I would have treated and didn't need to. It just didn't tell me anything useful. And all I got from it was, if you're going to treat them all.
Yeah.
Could I come in on your conversation?
You can, Colin.
Yeah,
my name is Colin Woodcock. I have kept bees for some years. I now only have one hive, and for years I've overwintered them on an open floor, a Varroa mesh floor. I'm interested to hear that you would block off the crown board at the top. I've never done that.
Okay.
But the hives I've had have been in a fairly an area where there's not a lot of draft.
Okay.
So I will do that. One thing that happened to me this year, I did have 3 hives, and I found 2 of them suddenly they just stopped. When I was looking through them, just no brood at all.
Okay.
Just the queen just stopped laying. And Jean Smye of Malden, I know her quite well. She said to me it's not unusual, and that I should burn those hives. In other words, it's a disease that affects the queen, and I shouldn't have them. So I haven't burned them. I've taken them away and put them in my workshop. But I have one quite healthy hive now, which I've overwintered. I fed it with the sugar solution twice, 2 gallons. And what I'm interested in listening to you now, each year I always leave a super or 2 on, because I just don't like to take all the honey away. And as well as giving them the solution, I just like to leave their honey on. My problem is in the spring, then the queen's been up there and had a lovely fine old time. And so I'm interested in what you're saying. I really should have put those supers underneath the brood chamber.
Yeah, so it means that the honey's still there for them.
Yeah.
And they'll clean it out and they'll move it into the brood nest or eat it.
Yeah.
Mainly eat it. And another interesting thing, a bee farmer friend of mine who's been keeping bees all his life, he's in his late 70s now, so he can't get around and feed all his bees, so he has just left a super of honey on the bees.
Yes.
And what he found was that obviously that hit his honey production the first year, but ever since that they've just continued to give him that back plus more. So I think that giving bees a super of honey, if you can afford it, is a decent investment, and the bees should return it with interest in the next season.
Yes.
Regarding what your colleague said about the bees, I mean, queens do go off lay, and usually they go back on lay.
Oh.
And queens can fail. So if a queen goes off lay for a few weeks in the autumn, that's pretty normal. But they usually start laying again, because they're going off lay to reduce the population down to a manageable level. And they go off lay because the worker bees won't let her lay. I've actually observed, and I've got a video of honeybees stopping a queen from laying, and they basically headbutt her and just stop her moving around the comb so that she can't lay. So often that's happening, and often I'm not aware of it because I'm not really looking at my hives too much at that time of year.
Yeah.
But if your bees die of disease, actually, just reminds me, actually, I should have included something on what to do with equipment over the winter, because I think people say about cleaning equipment. Now, there is no disease that you cannot clean equipment for.
Yeah.
So even if you've got the worst disease, which is American foul brood, the seasonal bee inspectors will torch your equipment. They'll burn the frames and the dead bees.
Yeah.
Everything apart from the outside equipment.
Yes.
There's no time that you need to burn equipment. You need to scorch it. So there's different diseases, types of disease you need to protect yourself from. The worst one is bacterial infection, AFB and EFB. Now, scorching will get rid of that, and that's pretty much the only.
Yeah.
Or for polystyrene, you can soak in bleach that is 1 to 5, 1 part bleach to 5 parts water, and that will get rid of bacterial infection. Viruses don't last, so you don't really need to worry about. It's like, you know, like the coronavirus. It's been shown to hang around on surfaces for a few days, but you know, if you leave a comb in a shed for the winter, the viruses will die.
Yeah, yeah.
And then the only other thing you've got to worry about is wax moth and fungal infection like nosema and chalk brood. And you can get rid of all 3 of those by using 80% acetic acid.
Yes.
And, so I use that. So other than that, that's, you know, for cleaning your equipment. So you can use soda solution to clean equipment, but soda solution only cleans, it doesn't disinfect.
Mm-hmm.
Then you need to, and it's 1 to 5 soda solution in proportion, 1 kilo to 5 litres. You know, 1 litre of bleach to 5 litres of water. So soda solution's great for cleaning. Bleach is great for disinfecting.
Yeah.
Scorching is good for disinfecting. But it's just, I think it's important just to understand what you're trying to do with what piece of equipment, and realise that, you know, soda will kill most bacteria, but I don't think it would kill AFB spores.
Yeah, I in the past I have used scorching. I quite like it because it cleans everything up as well. Cleans all the excess wax up. But the hive that I'm talking about, where she went off lay, I didn't do anything about it. I left them, and they died out naturally. So maybe the queen was she was just getting old, and they didn't requeen themselves.
That can happen.
Yeah, yeah.
These can just die out and not supersede.
I am, Kevin. I'm very much against chemicals. So I've never treated, and when I look through the hives, I'm kind of relying on my eyes to look for varroa and bees that are not formed properly. And so far, fingers crossed, I've done all right.
Fantastic. I mean, one thing I would just say as a word of caution is you don't normally see varroa mites in a hive.
No, I know. But you can see them on the bees, though, can't you?
Not normally. Only when they've got a very severe infection.
Oh.
The varroa mites, if you look at there's a video done by Samuel Ramsey, and he was at the National Honey Show. He's actually made a breakthrough in understanding the life cycle of varroa mites. What he has found is that, you know, we talk about the phoretic stage of mites, and phoretic means to be riding on a mite. But mites only do that when they're looking for a new host, and that's very rare.
Yeah.
Most of the mites are actually feeding on the bees on the underside between the plates. So if you turn the bees upside down, you can't see them. And what the mites are doing is they're feeding on the fat body of the bee. And in feeding on the fat body, they inject the bee with saliva, and that saliva is loaded with deformed wing virus.
Right.
And the bee's virus load goes from asymptomatic to clinical within 24 hours because they increase the amount of virus in the bee by 10,000 in 24 hours, 10,000 times.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not as well, they're feeding on the fat body, which is also the bee's immune system. And that's why it affects them so badly. Now, we actually had a talk by Professor Stephen Martin at our association a couple of months ago, and he was saying how deformed wings, you only notice deformed wings on bees that have been parasitized on the wing buds. It's not actually a sign of deformed wing virus.
Oh, yeah.
The virus itself is asymptomatic. and he's been studying Varroa and viruses since 1992, and he's a professor in the field. So you can't see the Varroa mites, and you can't tell the virus load of a hive.
So what you're saying is I should it'd probably be wise now to put a sheet in, Vaseline sheet, just to see what drop I've got.
Well, as I was saying to Gary, I've actually found that not to be too effective either.
Yeah, yeah, but at least I might then know if I have got Varroa mites in that hive. Could I do that now, this over winter?
Of course you can. You can do it anytime.
Right. Okay.
If you're going to do it on a board. Just use a light rubber Vaseline on it, because mites can blow away or get eaten.
Yeah.
Just do it for 24, 48 hours. Any longer than that is not accurate either.
Okay. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Okay, does anybody else have any other questions that they'd like to pose to Kevin? I think that's a no, Kev.
Okay, cool.
I'd like to say thank you very much. Excellent talk. Even I've learned something, so that's good, isn't it?
Okay, cool.
I think everybody has. And if there's nothing else, we'll look forward to seeing members in next month, which will be the
14th.
It'll be on Monday, the 14th. Thanks, Gary. The 14th of January, 14th of December, when we're going to have a friend of mine from France who is having to deal with the Asian hornet. So he's going to give us a bit of a chat as to how he copes with it. He says it's no problem, and that we've got nothing to fear. So let's hope he's right, but let's hope also that we never get it here. So I look forward to seeing members on the 14th of December.
This is the first time I've got this
I'd
email.
like to say good night. Thank you very much again, Kevin.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, no, that's okay. You'll get it from now on.
Okay, good. Oh, that's good. That's the first
So
email.
we hope
I've
that you'll
got.
come along.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
It's nice to see you, Colin.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
there's one
thanks,
thing I
Kev.
could I say something else?
Speak later.
Right. Okay. Bye.
Yeah. Go on then.
Well,
Bye.
bye.